There we go. Let's start again. So thank you for joining today's webinar on holds fulfillment. So this webinar was inspired by questions we tend to get on what happens with holds during and after you place a hold request. So these are questions like, how does Polaris determine like what item will fill a hold? Questions on what hold related alerts mean, such as the one featured in the webinar title. So in this session, we're going to do a deep dive into what happens on the back end with a request. So basically, we're just going to spend a good deal of this training just nerding out on hold settings in Polaris. Our objectives for today, we want to learn what limits and setting Polaris considers when placing a hold. We're going to see how a request ends up on a pick list, and we're going to see how Polaris determines hold fulfillment preferences. So here's our agenda for today. It doesn't look like a big one, but like I said, we're really going to do a deep dive into each of these. And so the first thing we're going to look at is what happens when you're placing a request. So how does Polaris determine if a request can be placed? So essentially, Polaris goes through a series of questions or things it looks at when it places a hold. And these are things like questions address patron code limits, pickup location limits, including material type limits, and item settings. So at this first stage, we're going to start out with dealing with patron code limits. So the first thing, Polaris looks at the patron code and asks, has the patron reached their hold limit? So a patron's hold limit is determined by their patron code. And for those who aren't as familiar with the patron record, the patron code is a field in the user's registration work form. So some examples you will see includes like NBK patron for a Northbrook patron, NBK educational, which could be a card for a teacher or a school in the district, and in-house use, which could be like a technical services department card. And it's the patron code that defines the user's circulation limits, including how many holds that patron can have at a time. So when you're placing a hold, Polaris looks at the user's patron code, and then it sees how many holds they're allowed to have. So for this particular patron, PRK adult, they can have up to 50 total holds at a time. So if the patron has exceeded their hold limit, Polaris is going to pause the transaction and it will give you an alert telling you the patron has exceeded the total request limit. And here is what you're going to see when you're working in Leap. So when you see the heading exceeded total request limit, when it's giving you that total request limit, you know that the patron has hit a cap. So you can run into this if the patron code has like a low limit, maybe it's a limited use type of card, or the patron is a super user, they've already placed a lot of requests, or like we're going to see in a few minutes, the pickup location does not allow the user to pick up holds. I also want to show you what the patron sees if they run into these blocks or alert situations related to holds. So if I'm using the online catalog and I try to place a hold when I'm already at my cap, here is what I'll see. So the Power Pack does display a message that I've exceeded the maximum number of requests, and it won't allow me to complete placing the hold. Now, if I haven't reached my hold limit, the next thing Polaris is going to check are the rules of the pickup library or the pickup location limits. So at this stage, Polaris asks, can the patron pick up holds at this location? And for the most part, the answer to this question is going to be yes. We support a pickup anywhere policy for CCS patrons, but there can be some occasional exceptions. So sometimes there are special card types. These are things commonly like school cards, business cards that could be local use only, meaning they can only be used at their home library. Second, libraries can also determine if non-CCS reciprocal borrowers are eligible to pick up at their location or not. So these are users from libraries outside of CCS, like Skokie, Chicago Public Library, or Schaumburg. So again, Polaris is going to look at the rules associated with that patron code to figure out if the card is restricted from picking holds at certain location. Now, this is a less common occurrence by far. But if a user is not allowed to pick up at a certain location based on their patron code, staff will once again see that exceeded total limit request when placing a hold and leap, since the patron essentially has a pickup limit of 0 at that location. And then it's the same thing for patrons placing a hold in the online catalog. They'll be blocked from placing the hold and they'll see the exceeded maximum number of requests message. So basically what you see and what the patron sees if the user has reached their hold cap, or if they are not allowed to pick up at a certain location, you will see those same messages. Now, we know that for most patrons, they will be able to use their desired pickup location. But additionally at this stage, Polaris is also going to look and see if there are specific material types that the pickup location limits or restricts. And when I talk material type here, I am talking about that value in the item record. So these are the category of item like book, book new, book hot, that's assigned to each individual item. And you're typically going to encounter limits or restrictions when it comes to things like new items or hot items, or more specialized material types, like your library of things, equipment, or things like your mobile hotspots. So I want to show you some examples to see how these material type limits and restrictions can impact placing a hold. So this first example we have is when a patron reaches a certain material type limit. So here we have a patron who already has 5 still pending holds on video game titles, and they're trying to place a hold for another video game. So they're placing a hold for a location that limits users to 5 video game holds, right? They're already at their cap. Now, when they try to place that 6 hold, Polaris sees that they're at their cap and they're trying to place a hold on more video game items. So the patron is at their max for that material type. They're going to throw up an alert. And this is the alert staff will see in LEAP. So staff will see an alert that the user has exceeded the material type request limit. So this message indicates the patron has reached the pickup location material type cap. And the really nice thing about this message is that it does tell us what material type we've reached and what that max value is. So here right away, we see that the patron is limited to 5 holds for material type video game at this location. They have already reached that. And then the patron is also going to see a similar message when placing a hold in the power pack. And here's what they'll see. They'll see requests cannot be placed because the account has exceeded the maximum number of requests for this material type. So this is an example of what you'll run into if there is a low hold limit for a type. And again, you're most commonly run into this type of limit when working with things that have like video games, right? Smaller collection size and a higher value. Probably also see this with things like playaway views or book club bags. Now, the next example I want to show you is what happens if there is a restricted material type. So you will usually encounter this with specialty items. Again, equipment type stuff or technology pieces like laptops. So in this example, we have a patron who is trying to place a hold for a vinyl record. However, the pickup location restricts holds on material type of record. So basically, all items attached to this bib have a material type of record and so are ineligible to fill that hold. So what we'll see in LEAP, if none of the items on the bib are eligible to fill the hold based on the pickup library's material type policy, I will again see that exceeded material type request limit alert, just like our last example. But this time, it's going to say that the patron has a hold limit of 0 for this material type. So this is how we know that it's a restricted material type when that request limit is just set to 0. And then the patron also sees the same block message in the Power Pack alerting them that they've exceeded the maximum number of requests for this material type. One thing about the pack alert, as you'll probably see here, it doesn't tell the patron what their limit is. So they essentially can't tell if it's a limited or if it's a restricted material type that they're trying to place a hold on. And then the final example with these material type limits I wanted to show you is an example where the patron is only ineligible for some of the items on the bib record due to their material type. Now, a lot of times this is going to be tied to those hot or those new material types. So I would say this is probably the most common alert that you will run into. So in this example, patron is placing a hold on a bib record where items have material types of book, book new, and book hot. So it's a mixture of all three material types. Now, it is a policy of the pickup library that they're not allowed to pick up items with a material type of book hot. However, the patron is still going to be eligible for book and book new items. So there's plenty of titles on this bib that's going to fill the hold. So this time, if the patron places a hold in the online catalog, Polaris will place it without interruption. So the patron's not going to see any type of block message. The hold is going to place just normal for them. Staff, on the other hand, will see this alert in these types of situations. So here's a screenshot, and I just want to kind of dissect this real quick. So we know the alert is telling us that the limit we're running into is tied to material type, right? Because it has exceeded material type request limit. And so it's not dealing with the patron's overall hold limit. And again, the nice thing about this message is that it does tell us what specific material type the limit is tied to. So this message here tells us the patron cannot pick up book hot items at this location. So none of the items with a book hot material type will be sent. However, here it also says not all material limits were exceeded. So this tells us that the patron is still eligible for other items on this bib record. So here, this is a flag that staff should click continue. They can finish placing the hold, and one of those other eligible material types will fill it. And again, only staff see this alert. So when placing hold in the online catalog, again, patrons aren't going to see any kind of alert. They will have a normal hold experience. So the key here is to look for that not all material limits exceeded message. So at this stage, excuse me, staff or a patron have placed a hold. Polaris has looked at the patron code limits. They've looked at the pickup library limits. And if the patron hasn't reached those limits, Polaris is next going to check for eligible items based on the item's hold settings. So it's going to take the item records attached to that bib record. It's going to look at the item's hold checkbox settings, which are currently located in the item record controls tab. And when I say the hold checkbox settings, these are the specific settings that I'm referring to. And the major checkbox here is the holdable checkbox. So this little checkbox here determines whether or not the item is eligible to be held. If the checkbox is selected or if it's active, the item is eligible to be held. So selected, eligible to be held, and it will fill holds. If it's not selected, the item cannot be held, regardless of the item's material type or who is trying to place the hold. So with this screenshot, the checkbox is selected, the item can be held. And then Polaris is also going to check these other hold limited to checkboxes just to see if there's other limitations. The most frequent one you will encounter is the patrons from this library and branches setting. This checkbox limits the item only to fill holds for users registered to the same library as the item. And then just below that, the setting is relatively new. It's a setting called days past first available. This setting limits the item to local holds just for a temporary period. So you will typically see this setting used with new items. Like for example, a newly released book will fill local holds just for the first 90 days. And then after that time is up, it will open up and fill anyone's holds. And finally, this last setting is not as common, but you may also encounter the pickup at checkbox. So this setting limits where the item can be picked up at. If this checkbox is not selected, which are majority of items, the item can travel for a hold to any library. If the checkbox is selected, the item is only eligible for holds with a pickup location of the indicated branch. So in this screenshot, the item will only fill holds if the pickup location is Glencoe. And this setting is used with items that cannot safely be sent in transit through delivery. Again, those equipment pieces, right? Your library of things, or items like large activity kits. So those are the hold settings that Polaris tends to look at when you're placing a hold. That's a lot of limits and settings that are considered, right, when that hold is placed. So let's see if we can visualize what happens during all of this. So we're at the help desk and we're placing a hold for a patron. Let's say this patron is Linkwood patron and they have a patron code of LNK patron. And they're placing a hold for a pickup at Morton Grove. And we're placing a hold on this bib record. This is for a relatively new Blu-ray title, let's say. So the first thing Polaris is going to do is look at how many holds in total this patron is allowed to have, and it makes sure that the patron has not reached their max limit. So this patron can have up to 100 holds on their card at a time. Let's say they have not reached their limit yet. So then we can move on to the next check. Here, Polaris is checking if they're allowed to pick up at the other library, which they are, right? They're not restricted from picking up at this location. And kind of along with this, Polaris is also going to look at the material types represented in that bib record and checks to see if the patron is restricted from picking up any of those material types at the pickup library. So let's say, for argument's sake, the pickup library restricts material type Blu-ray hot. So now here's a list of the items on the bib record. So now the patron is automatically excluded from any items on that bib with a material type of Blu-ray hot. But we still have items with material types of Blu-ray and Blu-ray new up for consideration with our hold. And then the final thing is Polaris is going to check those settings on those item records to see what is eligible to be held and what is not eligible. So now it's going to exclude items that are not holdable at all, or items from other libraries that can only be held by local patrons at this time. And so after looking at those limits and settings, it now knows which items will be eligible to fill the patron's hold at this moment. So at this time, Polaris is going to finish placing the hold, and it's going to source from one of these copies. Now, remember the days past first available setting in the item record. Once that days past first available time period is up, that's going to open up some eligibility for more copies. So let's say at this time, we've got some copies here that use the days past first available just for 45 days. And let's say enough time has passed where that period is up and that local only setting has expired. So that means that we have potentially some more copies that are going to fill our hold. So here we kind of went through this list together and limited what was eligible and what was not eligible. I just want to share a quick tip with you. You can see which items are currently eligible and can fill a hold right in the hold request record. So if you're in the hold request record, check under the satisfied by tab. So this list is going to show you which items are currently eligible to fill this hold. So basically this list is what we did right here. So let's wrap this section up and do a brief summary. So when placing a hold, we now know what limits and settings Polaris looks at. It looks at the patron code limits. It looks at the pickup location limits, including material type limits, and it looks at item settings. So now that the hold has been placed and it's out there, how does Polaris connect that hold with a copy? And I'm just going to pause for a second just to see if there are any questions so far before we move into the next section of the agenda. Okay. Let's see. So a hold is in place. Basically, now what? This answer is going to be different based on if there are available copies on shelf or not. So to move on to the next segment of our agenda, we are going to say that yes, there are available copies around the system. And because there are available copies, our hold is going to end up on a pick list somewhere. So the next section of this session is going to show you how it ends up on a pick list. When a hold is placed and Polaris sees that there are available copies in the system, the hold is going to enter what is called request to fill cycles. Shorthand, they're known as RTF cycles. So you likely have encountered this term already if you've ever looked at a hold request history tab. So you've probably have seen entries under the action column in the history tab that say things like primary RTF processing placed request on pick list, or secondary RTF processing placed request on pick list, or primary routing cycle completed, and then it indicates the secondary RTF cycle. So now we're going to learn what the process these action entries are tied to. So our first question here, like what exactly is a request to fill cycle? So when we're working with the RTF cycle, a cycle indicates a set of libraries. And the request to fill cycle, or the RTF cycle, determines which library's pick list a request is going to show up on. And as you can likely tell from those hold request history entries we just looked at, there are two request to fill, or RTF cycles, a primary cycle and a secondary cycle. And there's a really important purpose behind having two cycles, which is to reduce time and resources used when filling a hold. So let's look at these two cycles. The primary RTF cycle is always going to be the pickup location. And if that location is part of a multi-branch library, the primary cycle will also include those other branches. So, for example, for a hold request with a pickup location of Palatine, the primary RTF cycle is going to include Palatine's main location, the Rand Road branch, and the North Hoffman branch. And the pickup location is the primary cycle so that Polaris will try to source a copy from the pickup location or one of those branches first. And this ensures the fastest way for the patron to get the item in their hands. It saves delivery time, it saves delivery van gas, it saves time for staff to process the holds to go in transit and receive. So if the pickup location has a copy, it just makes sense that they get that request first. Or again, if it's a multi-branch library, it's still faster for the pickup location to get a copy from one of their branches than through Rails delivery. So primary RTF cycle, pickup location. The secondary RTF cycle includes all CCS libraries. So if the pickup location does not have a copy available, Polaris is going to expand and see what other libraries they can source a copy from. So when it enters the secondary cycle, in order to spread the pick list love, Polaris will select a random available copy from that list, and it pushes the hold to that library's pick list. Now, a hold can only be on one pick list at a time. So if it's not filled by that library in a given time, the request is going to move on to the next library in the RTF cycle sequence, and it's going to repeat that process until it's filled. So here's how the RTF cycles work in a slightly more visual representation. A hold request is created. So Polaris is going to check to see for eligible copies that are currently available. If Polaris detects available copies of the title in the system, the hold tries to enter the primary request to fill cycle. So first, Polaris is going to check to see if there are available copies at the pickup location. If there is, that branch automatically gets the hold request on their pick list. Now, if no copies are available at the pickup location, or the primary cycle library is unable to fill that hold, the hold will then enter the secondary request to fill cycle, meaning it's now going to look for copies at all CCS locations. So it's placed on a pick list at another library. If that library can't locate the item and ends up not filling the hold moves on to the next library in the secondary RTF cycle and is placed on their pick list. So basically that process is going to repeat here until some library fills that hold. Let's apply this to our hold example from the last section. So where we left off, we placed our hold and we know which items are eligible to fill our hold. So Polaris just now needs to find an available copy to fill it. So for example purposes, we will say all of these copies are available and on shelf. Polaris is first going to check the primary RTF cycle, which consists of the pickup location, Morton Grove Public Library. Now, the pickup location does not have an available copy. So our request is right away going to move into the secondary RTF cycle. So it's going to check all the other CCS libraries. Polaris looks to see which eligible copies here are available. So let's say in the meantime, we've got a couple copies that have been checked out, which makes them now ineligible for a pick list. And Polaris is just going to pick a random copy and it will add that request to the library's pick list. So Indian Trails is the lucky winner. Indian Trails will get our request on their pick list. If that library does not fill the hold, Polaris is going to push the request out to the next library in line. So I have some common questions that we get about the pick list and the RTF cycles. The first question is, how long do requests stay in each cycle? So a hold will stay in the primary request to fill cycle for 7 days. The pickup location and the branches have up to 7 days to pull a copy and fill that hold. So they have kind of a lengthy amount of time to fill. Now, a hold altogether cycles around the secondary request cycle for 1 full year, but a request is going to stay on an individual pick list for 2 days before moving on to the next library. So like if 2 libraries own a copy, and neither one pulls it to fill the hold, which like they won't, no one's going to do that. Basically, the hold request will then just kind of move from pick list to pick list over and over again for a full year. Second question, what happens if you can't locate the pick list item, but you don't want the request to like sit on your pick list for those few days? Basically, can you move hold to the RTF cycles more quickly? And the answer is like, yes. If you are struggling to locate your copy, there are a couple ways to push that request on to another library. The first and the easiest thing that you could do is change the circulation status of an item to missing. So this is going to tell Polaris that the copy is not available. It will push the request to the next pick list before that 7 days if you're primary, or the 2 days if you're secondary are up. The second option can only be used if the request is already in the secondary RTF cycle. This also requires pick list permissions. So you do need to be part of the pick list permission group to do this. But in the LEAP pick list work form, there is also an option to mark a request as Ask Me Later. And what this does is that this pushes the request on to the next library, but it gives the request the opportunity to cycle back to you if it's not filled by other locations. And then finally, what happens if a request is on my pick list, but a different copy is returned elsewhere? So another library checks in a copy. And this answer is going to depend on if the request is currently in its primary request to fill cycle or the secondary RTF cycle. If the request is in the primary cycle, meaning like the hold anticipates being filled by the pickup library, like it's on the pickup library's pick list, even if another copy is returned elsewhere and checked in, nothing is going to happen to that hold. It wants to be filled by the pickup library, so that other copy is not going to go in transit. However, if the request is in the secondary RTF cycle, so like pickup library does not have a copy available, the request is now looking outwards to all other libraries to fill that hold, a returned copy could trap for the request. So if your pick list item hasn't been checked in and trapped for that request yet, and another copy is checked in at a different library, that other library's copy will trap for the request. So once that happens, the request will automatically be removed from your LEAP pick list since that request has been fulfilled. Let's do a quick recap about the RTF cycles here. So if a hold is placed and there are available copies in the system, Polaris will place the hold in the request to fill cycle or the RTF cycles to determine where to send that request. It will always try to start out in the primary RTF cycle where it looks for available copy at the pickup location or one of that location's branches. And then if no copies are available at the pickup location or branches, the hold goes into the secondary RTF cycle where it looks for a copy at all other CCS libraries. So requests will cycle around and that secondary RTF until the request is filled. That was 2 sections we just looked at with a whole lot of settings. Again, I'm going to pause, see if there's any questions before we move on to talking about holds queues. Okay, so final section we're going to talk about is how the holds queue fills holds. So earlier, when we placed our hold, we asked, how does Polaris connect that hold with a copy? And we said the answer is going to be different based on if there are available copies on shelf or not. Ooh, I have a question. I'm going to pause here. What happens if the item is on the pick list and another patron in the library checks it out before it can be pulled? That's a good question. If that happens, it's basically counting your item as ineligible anymore, and it's going to push the request out to the next library in the cycle. Yeah. That's the fun thing with the pick list. It's like an infinite amount of situations and scenarios with what can happen with a copy and with the hold. It is fun but overwhelming to think about sometimes. So what happens now if there's no eligible copies in the system? So we know that if nothing's available, like, it's a big demand title, there's no eligible copies, the patron is going to be added to the holds queue for the title, right? The request is going to end up on the queue, and requests will be filled as things are being checked in. And then Leap, you've probably seen the holds queue for a title. So when you're looking at a hold queue work form, you'll be seeing requests from all CCS libraries in a single list, basically. Now, the holds queue work form has 2 different views separated out by tabs. One is the queue view, and the other is the all hold request view. The queue view lists just the active holds. So these are holds with a status of requested or locating, which means the request is currently on someone's pick list. And when you're looking in this view, holds are going to be listed in the order that they're placed. So you will see the request date, which is the date that the hold was created. Now, the other tab, the all hold request tab, this lists all requests tied to a bib record regardless of status. So in this tab, you're going to see not only those active holds, but anything that's like suspended or paused, things that are currently ready for pickup or went unclaimed, even canceled holds. So it lists everything. And then in this tab, it also lists holds in alphabetical order by patron name. So it does not reflect any kind of like queue order. The nice thing is, both tabs also feature a filter box, which is really handy if you're trying to get a sense of like just your local holds. So like in the queue tab, you can set the filter box to limit by patron branch. You can enter your library's name and then see how many local active holds are out there. And one other thing the queue does in the filter view is that it reassesses the position to the scope of the filter. So like here, this first person in line for Zion Benton, they could be like number 50, number 60 in the overall queue. But when you're scoped to just Zion patrons, they are the first Zion patron in the queue. And this is going to be important because when a copy is returned, who does it trap for? Because we are in a consortium environment, the answer is not as straightforward as the number one person in the queue. So we want to prioritize giving our copies to our local patrons. And in a queue situation, Polaris applies a function called the prefer my patron function. So when something is returned and it's checked in, prefer my patron will prompt an item to trap for local holds before filling other libraries' patrons' requests. And to do this, it uses the item record assigned branch field and the patron's registered at field to determine who is a local patron. So this is nice because it means the return location does not impact the behavior of prefer my patron at all. It's entirely up to the items assigned branch and the patron's registered at field. So here's an example. I have an in-demand item that's being returned. This copy belongs to McHenry. When it's checked in, Polaris is going to look at the queue and see who the next patron in the queue that's registered to McHenry, and then it's going to prompt to fill the hold for that patron. It's only if there are no McHenry holds left in the queue, then the item is going to trap for the first person in line. So for my Circ people in the audience, this is really important reason why we use a different registered at branch for those non-CCS reciprocal borrowers. So like Chicago patrons, Waukegan patrons, by setting those non-CCS users, by setting their registered at branch to CCSB instead of like your own library, this just makes sure that they aren't counted as local patrons during this fulfillment process. So one very important thing to know about Prefer My Patron is that it does not kick in if an item's status is available. So if the item is actively out there, checked out, it went unclaimed on the hold shelf, it was in repair, it's in transit, and you check that item in, Prefer My Patron is going to apply. But if the item's circulation status is available, Polaris assumes that there isn't a queue for the title. And if trapping the hold, it's not going to look for local patrons first. It's just going to trap for the first person in line. Vast majority of the time, like 99% of the time, this is going to be the case. If an item is available, there's a very good chance that there's not going to be an active queue with multiple people on it. But if something weird happens at check-in, maybe I accidentally said like no to filling the hold and the item goes into available status, this can actually disrupt the Prefer My Patron process. Now, thankfully, there's a couple ways that we can remedy this. The easiest thing to do is that you can change the item's circulation status like missing or repair, save the changes, and then check the item in again. Since that circ status is no longer available, the item is checked in, Prefer My Patron, that function is going to kick back in. The second thing you can do is you can use the hold queue to locate the next local patron in line and basically force fill their hold with the item using a function called fill now. So you'll see this active once you select the hold. you'll see the Fill Now option pop up. It will expand this field here where you can like scan a barcode in to manually fill the hold. So once the item is scanned in, it's going to trap for this specific patron and this specific hold. The item will become ready for pickup and the patron will receive their hold notice. And then the item is now back in circulation. You've basically manually reinstituted Prefer My Patron. So we have full instructions on our website on how to use Fill Now. I've also linked to it in the agenda. But one important thing I do want to put out there, if you use Fill Now, my big recommendation, only use this if you have the item in hand and can scan it. If you think like, hey, this item is on shelf, but you haven't grabbed it yet, grab it first. Don't copy paste the barcode in case you end up not being able to find that item and now the patron's hold is ready for pickup. Also, I say like best practice is not to key in a barcode in case you mistype it. And this is because when you use Fill Now, it's going to accept any item to fill the hold. So this feature was actually designed to allow holds to be filled by different formats. So, a situation where like the patron has a hold on a Blu-ray, but it turns out they find there's a DVD copy on shelf and ask staff to grab that instead. So even though the DVD is on a different bib and it's a different format, staff could use it with Fill Now, so the patron's hold is considered fulfilled and they don't get like multiple copies of a title. I hope that makes sense. So the moral of the story here is to only use Fill Now if you have the copy in hand. Okay, to summarize this section, if there are no copies available to fill a hold, the request is going to be added to a holds queue for the title. Polaris uses the function called Prefer My Patron, and this way, when items are returned, they will prioritize filling local holds first before trapping for other libraries' patrons. However, Prefer My Patron is not going to apply to items that currently have a circulation status of available. Good thing is, we just learned about a couple methods to use if Prefer My Patron is disruptive and there's still an active queue. We're at the wrap-up point. I just want to pause and see if there are any questions related to queues, hold queues, before we kind of wrap things up here. Let's do a quick review of what we've learned today. We just learned about a whole bunch of settings. We learned what limits and settings Polaris looks at when a hold is being placed. These settings include the patron's hold limit, the pickup location limit, including material type limits, and item record hold settings. We also learned about hold fulfillment. So we saw how Polaris uses request to fill, or RTF cycles, to fill requests using a pick list. And then if there's a queue for a title, we saw how Polaris determines the order of fulfillment. So I also want to highlight a related resource on the CCS website that gives a high-level overview of the settings we looked at today, and that is a holds resource page. So you can access the page using this direct link here, or you can find it by looking under the How to Public Services Department page, and you'll find the hold resource page under the holds section. Your agenda has both the direct link and the pathway if you are interested. I also include a link to Fill Now, just in case you'd like to see some step-by-step instructions for that. And I also want to give a shout out to the Old Holds report. So this is a web report, and it lists patrons that have active holds that are 30 days or older. So this report shows you holds that like maybe traveling around that secondary RTF cycle for whatever reason, or some like other weird outlier situations. So you can just see what potentially should be being filled, but it's not. So again, the session is being recorded. We'll have the recording available in the next day or so. You'll get a link in your email, and you should also spot it in an upcoming issue of CCS News. There will also be a link to training evaluation form. Actually, before I forget, let me pop that into chat as well. If you have a few minutes, it always helps us out if you can fill the eval out. We have question in there where you can make suggestions on future training topics, which we always love to see. So I'm going to open up for questions at this time. Later on, though, if you find you have a question, always feel free to email help@ccslib.org. So I'm going to stop talking at this point, and I'll see what questions you may have. So is there some new information in here, or is this stuff that you've are already familiar with? I'm just curious. I'm glad. I feel like the with holds, it's one of those things where it's like yeah, you can really pull back those layers and just get more and more in depth on how like holds and holds fulfillment works. So I'm going to stop the recording at this time.